As we mentioned in previous lessons, the agricultural changes that took place under the early period of Mao led to the Great Famine. Now, we are going to spend this lesson talking about potentially some of the causes of the Great Famine that have been cited by historians, some of the debate around the Great Famine itself, i.e., the responsibility on the part of certain actors within the Chinese state, such as Mao himself, as well as the actual famine itself. Look at some of the actual details of the famine as it took place. So we know that between 1958 and 1962 there was a Great Famine. The causes of the famine are numerous, and as we'll get to later, we will examine these in more detail. But the famine itself is, in fact, the worst documented famine of the 20th century, and potentially the worst documented famine in all of human history. There might be some debate about that. I'll have to check the specific citation on that, but I'm pretty sure it's at least, if it's not the first, it's at least the top 5, maybe top 10 worst famines in all of human history. It is estimated that between 30 to 50 million people would die during this famine. So, the thing that we have to just very briefly touch on very quickly is to just talk a little bit about life during the famine itself. As you could imagine, life was particularly terrible during the famine because so many people died. There would be people who would attack food stores to try and get at the food, something that would yield the death sentence in the state. There was also widespread oral reports of cannibalism during the famine, as one could probably imagine. If people are starving, they're probably going to start to resort to all kinds of horrendous different acts that to try and manage to feed themselves. Now, while the official documentation is relatively limited in regards to reports of cannibalism, it is still quite a believable claim. When you have a famine of at least 30 to 50 million people dying, it seems to suggest that there was probably instances where cannibalism takes place, seeing as cannibalism, while there are a lot of widespread oral reports, there is also the common understanding that during famines there is an increased rate of cannibalism that exists. So that's just the basic facts of the Great Famine itself. We don't really need to go into that much detail about what life was like during the Great Famine. You can understand how terrible it was. From the perspective of historians, which is what we are, we have to talk about a number of subsidiary issues related to the Great Famine. We have to talk about, for example, the causes of the Great Famine and responsibility placed on certain individuals. So, historians place the causes of the Great Famine on a number of different policies. There are an ample range of examples of failures that existed within the Chinese state, some of which were directly as the result of Mao's policies, some of which were the result of other issues. But for the most part, these are the policies that generally take the blame or get the blame for the Great Famine. So we have Mao's Great Leap Forward, which was his second 5-year plan. Now, we're going to talk about that in a couple of lessons' time because it's going to focus on industrial policy in the next few lessons. So we'll get back to that in a few lessons' time. But just to note that is one of the major factors that is considered to be one of the great causes of the famine. There was the establishment of the People's Communes. We know already that this is a relatively controversial understanding, the extent to which the communes were responsible, but a consequence of the communes is the fact that we see the over-reporting or the misrepresentation of reporting relating to the amount of grain production that took place, and so we have to really examine that through the lens of the People's Communes that existed. Now, the reason why it's relatively controversial, the extent to which we can directly lay the blame of the famine onto the communes, is because the timelines of the famines aren't exactly consistent across all of China. It seems to have taken place in different regions at different times across the few years that it had taken place. And so the extent to which we can really lay a cause and effect link from the People's Communes to the Great Famine itself is something of a dubious claim to make. And I think any of these claims, any of these causes that we have, if we were to just place the blame onto one of these causes, that would probably be a little bit dubious in and of itself. I think it's a combination of these different causes that led to the Great Famine. We also have the combination of two factors here, the idea of collectivization on the one hand and also Lysenkoism on the other hand. Remember, Lysenkoism is this idea that was purported by a Soviet biologist, Lysenko, who developed a number of different agricultural practices that turns out to be scientifically inaccurate, but that Mao supported the belief of, the idea that you should have grain stores be moistened in lower temperatures before they are planted, like the seeds, for example. Also, the distribution of planting was something that Lysenko believed should be done where the seeds were planted very close together. All of these things were scientifically inaccurate and led to a massive dramatic drop in the amount of grain production that existed. Collectivization as well, on the other hand, was this policy of creating these collective communes, creating the mutual aid teams, creating the APCs, the agricultural producers cooperatives, and then also creating, of course, the people's communes. So we also have other factors as well. So, for example, the previously examined Four Pests campaign, the idea of trying to remove the pests, alleged pests, that ate the grain that was essentially attempting to be used to produce for agricultural products. This led to the increase in the population of crop-eating insects instead. So essentially, with the Four Pest campaigns, while you're eliminating the threats that these different birds and other crop-eating creatures posed to agriculture, you're eliminating those threats, but at the same time you're then, as a result of that, increasing other threats such as locusts. And then, as mentioned earlier on, there was false reporting. Within the communist system, there were reports of excessive production of grain, whereas in reality these reports were false, and they were due to pressures from other members of the party. There are some examples of this being the case. So, for example, in the Sichuan province, the reports suggested a steady increase in grain production between 1958 and 1961, whereas in reality there was a steady decrease in grain production. So essentially the opposite was being reported, whereas in reality that was what was taking place. Similarly, in Gansu, there was a decline in the yield of grain by 4.3-ish million tons between 1957 and 1961, but this was not reported. It was just something that the opposite was essentially reported. They were reporting positive grain reports and positive grain yields. The ending of the famine was something that was not done necessarily by Mao himself. Mao saw the Great Famine as a national embarrassment onto him personally. And as such, we would see Deng Xiaoping and Liu Shankoi delegate the power instead. He would delegate the power to these two particular individuals. They would relax some of these strictly collectivist policies towards farming. They would reduce the size of the communes and allow for some private farming to exist as well. And so we see a replacement of the walking on two legs campaign with the agriculture as the foundation of the economy slogan instead. So essentially there was a reversal of a number of Mao era and Maoist principles relating to agricultural policy and relating to collectivization more generally, to allow for there to be a greater production of grain and a greater production of agricultural produce to actually be able to feed the individuals who are working these particular farms. Food markets were also opened up to allow individuals to sell and trade grain as well. So we see that by 1965 we get the agricultural production going back to the 1957 levels. So it's only until 1965 that we actually see a reversal of the detrimental policies towards agriculture that had plagued China during this particular period. So the question for historians that we need to ask is the extent to which Mao was actually responsible for the Great Famine itself. Was Mao actually responsible? Well, this is arguably the most controversial debate around this particular topic, because on the one hand, you have some historians such as Chang and Halliday who would suggest that the Great Famine was solely the responsibility of Mao, and that the responsibility rests all on Mao's shoulders. And you can see why. There are a number of different reasons for this. Mao's explicit ordering of grain requisitioning, the refusal to change the policies after the famine had begun. We have the Four Pests campaign as well that also didn't make things particularly better for anybody. And whether or not you can You can chalk this up to maliciousness, or you could chalk this up to incompetence. These two historians argue that Mao was responsible for the famine itself. However, you also have other historians like Jing Xiaodong, who suggest that instead it was actually other members of the party who would bear the brunt of the responsibility for the famine instead, because they were the ones who were falsely reporting the amount of grain that was being produced, etc., etc. So I think a historically accurate understanding of this particular topic and a historically accurate understanding of Mao's responsibility would place somewhere in the middle of these two arguments. On the one hand, Mao was definitely responsible for a number of different elements of the Great Famine, so the creation of the people's communes, the collectivization policies, the Four Pests campaign, the insistence on Lysenkoism. All of these things were definitely very Maoist in nature, very much resting on the shoulders of Mao himself. But then the over-reporting and the false reporting of grain production is something that isn't necessarily Mao's fault. It's the fault of other members of the party. So you could really place blame on a number of individuals.